welcome, Ellen.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
Thrilled to have you
back.
here. Ellen, actually earlier today with Meredith Black talked to a town hall we had, and Ellen also has done a lot in the Federal Reserve System and our leadership training programs around the system, around the country. And so we're glad we've had her in the 11th district, but she's really been an asset to the Federal Reserve. So thank you for all you've done with the Fed and for your leadership. And I'm going to start because I'm most curious about this, and probably other people are. How did you become an astronaut? How'd that happen?
Well, a lot of astronauts, of course, especially the men astronauts, they decided when they were little, and of course, everybody in the country that grew up about the same time I did was watching the Apollo programs. But at that time, of course, no women astronauts, so I literally never thought about it. Nobody would ever ask, you, if you're a little girl, do you want to grow up and be an astronaut? So in high school, I unfortunately actually really hardly took any science. I only took the minimum required because, I don't know, I didn't think I was particularly interested. I didn't know any scientists. I didn't know any engineers, so I wasn't really headed down that path at all. But fortunately, I did take a lot of math. I liked math. I did well in math, and so I started calculus in high school. And when I went off to college, I thought I was going to major maybe in music or maybe in business, kind of changed my mind, tried a bunch of other things. But I finished up the calculus series. And I can remember near the end of the last semester, I was talking to some of the other students, and of course they were all in there because they needed it for their engineering courses or their science courses, and I was like, well, I'm just doing this for fun. I like it, So I thought maybe I should go check out some of those other fields. So I went and talked to a professor in the electrical engineering department, and to say the least, he was not very encouraging. He talked about, well, we had a woman come through this course once, and
wow.
He was picking things up off his desk. Well, you'll have to work with these, and I don't really know if this would appeal to you or whatever. But then I went to talk to a physics professor, and he said, well, first of all, let me just ask you how much math you've taken. So I said, well, I finished the calculus series, and he just got so excited because he said, well, you've already learned the language of physics. You've learned the language, so if you decide to study it, you can just focus on the concepts. He goes, you'll be so far of the other students because they're usually simultaneously, of course, taking calculus with with physics. He said, I think you do really well. And then the other important thing he said was he started to talk about what kinds of careers you can do with a physics major. And I have to say I had no idea because, like I said, I didn't know anybody. And so I really couldn't picture, like, if you major in physics, what does that mean? What do you actually do with that? And, he was really the first one that sat me down to talk me through it. So anyway, that's how I got into physics.
Yeah.
And then through some summer jobs at where I got to do some research, it became pretty clear that if you want to be involved in research, you really need an advanced degree. So I went off to Stanford, and it was my first year at Stanford when I was getting my master's that the space shuttle flew for the first time. And that was a really big deal because it was a very different kind of spacecraft. And it was designed to do a lot of things, including science and engineering research, which is the direction that I was headed. And because they then were looking for people who were scientists, engineers, medical doctors, they had broadened what types of careers they were looking for in terms of selecting astronauts. Just a couple years before that, they had selected the first group of astronauts specifically to train for the shuttle. And of course, that was the famous 1978 class that included 6 women, it included the first minority astronauts.
Right.
And so all those things kind of came together. And a couple years after the first flight, Sally Ride flew, huge deal. And she had been a physics major, I had been a physics major. She had gone to Stanford. I was at Stanford at that point doing my PhD. And so that was really the first time it ever even occurred to me, well, this is something you could actually go try to do. And so, it was a bit of a circuitous path, but I decided as soon as I got my PhD, I would send in my application.
And
Now, it was still 5 years later
who do
before
you
I was
send it
selected.
in to?
Exactly. So that was my first question. I wrote NASA, like, how do you even apply? Like, I had never really even thought about it before.
Okay.
But you fill out literally an application that's exactly the same as for any government job.
All right.
But then they do have a couple of extra sheets, and one of them talks about, one of them asks if you have piloting experience,
Right.
which at that time I did not.
Right.
But you just send it off, and NASA only does a selection every few years when they need new astronauts. They look at the flight manifest and how many people they have. So it was about 2 years after I applied when they did the first kind of selection. And what had happened in the meantime was the Challenger accident.
Right.
So, obviously they had stopped flying for a little bit, but they delayed selection a year. But I was called to actually interview for a class that was going to be selected in 1987.
And may I ask, what's the interview consist of?
So you spend a week at Johnson Space Center. So first of all, that was exciting.
It's a week-long interview.
Yeah, it is. And it was the first time I'd ever been at Johnson Space Center. So, that was just hugely exciting. Yeah. And to be honest, most of the week is medical testing.
Okay.
So you see all different kinds of doctors. And
any physical requirements?
Not so much. What's really important is that you are healthy and that you don't.
I always think of that thing that's going like this, and you're
Yeah.
you're in there, and
No, they didn't.
and
They
your
don't
face
put you
is
in-
all
yeah.
distorted.
Yeah,
No.
Fortunately, they found out after Mercury and Gemini that you didn't really have to go through that.
Okay. Wow.
But they want you to be healthy and not take any medications
All right.
because the body doesn't respond the same
And they
way.
don't like send you out to run 5 miles and see if you can do it.
No.
Nothing.
I thought they would. But they
Wow.
don't. And
Okay.
then you get tours of
Okay.
the center and where astronauts train. You get a chance to talk to astronauts, and then there's an hour-long interview with the astronaut.
And then based on all that, they
selection
made a decision.
Yeah.
And then they tell you you've been
panel.
selected. And
Except
then
I wasn't that year.
I see. So what I was going to ask is, once you're selected, how long do you train then?
So
And what's
anyway,
the
the next
training?
selection was 3 years later. I was selected then.
Okay.
And you come in as a class. My class was 23 people.
Huh.
And so we really spend the first year just training together really as a class. And you train on all the shuttle systems, and you do some science and engineering, some orbital mechanics. You learn more about NASA because most people come not having already worked at NASA.
Physically demanding?
So we have a gym, and they encouraged us to work out, but we didn't have any specific requirements. Now, I will say that has changed somewhat because, I was there during the space shuttle era, and we were doing flights of 8, 9, 10, 11 days. Now people spend 6 months on
I
orbit.
see.
And it's really important that you exercise every day on orbit. And so they have much more of a training regimen on the ground before they go. And then, they specify what you need to do on orbit. And then, the first people you see practically after you land, once you get back to Houston, is the strength and conditioning folks who are going to help you rehab after your mission.
Because of the weightlessness.
Yeah. So, you have to, your vestibular system's changed. Even though we do a good job, with keeping muscle mass, it's still, you have to build back up to where you were.
So first year you trained, and then the next 2 years leading up to the
So
flight?
the next year you do part-time training, and you do different kinds of things. Like I started to train on the robot arm.
Okay.
I started to do some spacewalk training. And then you get assigned jobs in the office. So my first job was to follow some of the software changes that were being made and represent the office at meetings where they talked that. And then I had a job associated with the robot arm and things like that. And then I was assigned a mission after I'd been there about 2 years.
And your job assigned and the mission, your role on the mission was?
So my first 2 flights, we flew a suite of instruments that were studying Earth's atmosphere, and particularly the problem of the ozone hole and ozone depletion. So we had a number of instruments that would measure chemical constituents in the atmosphere, and then instruments that would measure the amount of light coming from the sun in different wavelengths. Because what they were trying to do is understand, well, how much of the ozone depletion problem is being caused by humans, and particularly chlorofluorocarbons, was the big issue, and how much is caused by the natural solar cycle of the sun, which is an 11-year cycle. And so that was sort of the premise for the mission. And so everybody always has a variety of jobs on the mission. In terms of the payload, there were 2 out of the 5 of us that were really responsible for the instruments and for making sure that a lot of them were actually programmed from the ground, but we had equipment on board where we could see how things were going, and if there was an issue, we knew what to do. And of course, we also talked about the mission and what each science instrument did, so we would send down, updates, kind of public affairs updates about
And
each
how many
instrument.
days was that mission?
So that one was 9, and one of the other things that we had was a science satellite to study the solar wind, so I used the arm to deploy it in orbit.
Okay.
And then we came back a couple days later and rendezvoused with it, and then I used the arm to grab it and put it back in the payload bay because the data was stored on board.
Okay. And
So that was another job.
a couple more quick questions on
Yeah.
this. The takeoff. Does anything prepare you for being on a rocket that is launching?
Well, it's really helpful to talk to people that have done it.
Yes.
And then we actually, one time, we get one opportunity to come to San Antonio, to Brooks Air Force Base, where they have a big centrifuge.
Yes.
And they've essentially programmed it so that you go through an 8.5-minute launch, with the changes in acceleration that you will see when you actually do the real launch. And that's extremely helpful because so you get up to about 3 Gs, and they're through your chest, so it feels like someone that weighs about 3 times as much as you is sitting on your chest. So you get to feel what that's like, which is really helpful because you know just exactly how heavy it's going to feel.
Right.
And if you hadn't felt that, you'd think like, is
might
this going to
panic.
get a lot worse?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
it going to get really heavy? Because it's already somewhat hard to breathe. You can
Sure.
still breathe, but you're working at it. And if you have to reach toward a switch or something like that, of course the G's are pulling your arms back. So you get some opportunity to understand what that's going to be like before you actually go launch.
And the second question of the 2 I was going to ask is, so what roles fear play in doing this? Because these are just the questions I want to ask. I hope but I'm just curious. So people, you would think if you were going to send me up in a rocket, some people are afraid to fly.
Yeah.
Some people are afraid to drive, probably. But if you
So
before
I'll
you
talk
take
about
off,
2 fears that I had. One of them, our crew was in a press conference about 10 days before we go launch. And, I got this question from a journalist about, what are you most afraid of? And I said, I'm most afraid of being in a car accident between now and when I go launch, because I really want to go launch and I don't want anything to happen, to prevent that, because, you prepared for this. You really want to do it. But the other thing is, I wasn't, and most people, they're not really thinking about the personal fear. It's more about, hey, I've trained to do this mission. Everybody's watching.
Right.
Plucking these satellites out of the space is not the easiest thing, and things can go wrong, and they can start spinning out of control. And so you're really just thinking about, I really want to do my job well. I want to make sure that what I'm responsible for, that it goes well, and that I do my job well. And so you are just concentrating literally every single minute that you're in space.
And in this program, once your mission is over and you're back, you go back then to work at the Space Center and be supportive of other missions?
Yes, exactly.
And then you get called again to do another one?
Yes.
And what was the interval between your first and your second? And
between my first and second, it was only a year and a half. And part of it was we were flying these same instruments.
Yeah.
And so they wanted at least one person who had already operated them to be on it. So, And then I had a period of several years where I didn't fly, but part of it was my husband and I were trying to start a family. So on my third flight, I actually had a 1-year-old. And then by the time I flew on my fourth flight, I had a 3.5-year-old and a little guy that turned 2 while I was in orbit. So got to wish him happy birthday.
And basically, while in between missions, you're in effect grooming executive capability and other skills at the Space
So one
Center?
of the things I did in the few years between my second and third mission is I was leading the Astronaut office support to the International Space Station. And at that time, of course, it didn't exist. You know, it was being designed. They were just starting to manufacture some pieces in the U.S. Only a couple years before then, we had decided to include Russia, and so that had caused a lot of redesign. So my job was to make sure that we were at all the meetings where important decisions were being made, like are we going to have windows or not, things that astronauts care about, a lot of the safety issues. But also, I got to go over to Russia a number of times, and we were negotiating with members of the Russian Space Agency and their prime contractors on how we were actually going to operate the station. So we had protocols on how are we going to select our crews, and what role do the other space agencies have to say in one agency's selection. How are we going to train? Where are we going to train? What language are we going to train in? What language are we going to talk on the station? Who's going to get trained on what systems? All of that stuff. So I was part of all of those
and you learned a lot.
Yeah. It's something I never thought about, when I originally, of course, was interested in becoming an astronaut.
So after your last space mission, how did you come to eventually be head of the Space Center?
Yeah, so on my fourth mission, I was pretty sure it was either my last mission or at least my last mission for a while, because I was one of the senior astronauts. I'd flown a lot. I'd done a lot of the management jobs in the office, and about half of our office had never flown at all. And that was just had to do with we had, for a while, kind of given more credence to people who had already done spacewalks, because we were starting at this time the assembly of the station. And so we wanted people who had already done spacewalks to be on some of those initial crews. So now we were really going to try to have a push to fly folks who had not flown. And so I figured it was going to either be a long time or, before I flew again. And so the opportunity came up to be the deputy director of the organization that manages the whole astronaut office and our aircraft ops division. And so that was sort of the first leap out of the astronaut office. And then later on, I became director of that organization. And then I was asked to be deputy center director, and then eventually center director.
And just for people here who are not as familiar, how many employees do you have at the Johnson Space Center?
So we have a combination of government and contractor employees, and we have a little under 3,000 government employees, and then around 6,000 to 7,000 contractor employees.
And the annual budget of this operation?
It's about $4.5 billion.
Okay.
It was a couple years before I took over, it was about 6 when the shuttle was still flying.
Yeah.
And then in the years since 2012, say, it's hovered just pretty much right exactly at $4.5 billion.
And the biggest challenge you face in this job, biggest thing that you worry about, if you're in that seat, what's keeping you up at night?
So I kind of think about, I have 2 main roles, so I have kind of one big issue in each role. So the first role is our operational role, right? We have people in space every minute of every day. The entire time I was center director, that was true. And so you always have to be thinking about the safety of your people, and that at any second something could go wrong. And is your team prepared? And do you have the right skills? And do you have the right procedures? And do you understand the equipment that we're doing? Or if we were doing something new in space, have we adequately reviewed it? Our folks launch from Kazakhstan on a Russian vehicle. If they had some issue on a recent flight, have we gotten enough information? So that's one big part of it. And so you're always thinking about that. The other big part, though, is, and any organization faces this, right, is what is the future for us, and are we doing the right things today to make sure that we are going to be leading human spaceflight in the future? And I think the biggest issue you face there is it's really kind of complacency, right? It's like we know how to do spaceflight. We've been handed these big spaceflight programs throughout our history. We have the procedures, but the thing is, spaceflight 10 years from now is not going to be like it is today. And of course, we've already done a lot with international cooperation. And a big thing over the last few years has been all the new companies that are coming in, SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, all of those. And if we want to continue to lead human spaceflight, and I think there's a very important role for the government to do that, and for Johnson Space Center to continue to lead the human part of it, then we cannot be doing things, 10 years from now the way we're doing them today.
Yes.
So I'm
familiar with this issue.
It's about shaking it up. It's about shaking it up.
Yeah.
And to me, the interesting thing is, and I've talked a little bit about this at some of the Fed leadership conferences, because I think it is very applicable to the Fed as well.
It is.
We have this failure is not an option culture. Obviously, and of course, that's very important when you're talking about the human lives that we deal with. And yet, if you're trying to innovate, what's the mantra of innovation? It's fail early, fail often. Well, how confusing is that for employees at Johnson Space Center when their whole careers they've been told, hey, failure is not an option. And so it was really about trying to say, look, you have to look at what we're doing, and in some cases, this is the right culture, and in other cases we really have to build up and realize that there's a different way to do some of the things that aren't directly going to affect people's lives.
Did you have, as you tried to make changes and push people, did you get pushback, and what kind of pushback did you get, and how'd you deal with it?
Yeah, so I was pretty lucky in that my senior management in general really kind of understood that we needed to do different things. Now, it was really easy for the head of one organization to go, that organization over there, they really need to change. So, one of the things you have to deal with is say, well, let's look at, each person needs to look at their own organization too. But certainly, there were certainly a lot of people at the center that felt like, hey, we're successful at what we're doing. Look, we built the International Space Station, we're operating it. We're kind of running on all cylinders kind of thing. Why would you talk about changing?
Right.
And so we did this really interesting leadership action with my senior leaders where we talked about polarities, where you say, polarity is like tried and true versus, new and innovative. And it's never about choosing one, right?
Right.
It's about looking at your situation and saying, have we overemphasized one to the detriment of the other so that our overall goal, which is advancing human spaceflight, is not being served well? And, you talk about, well, what are the advantages of each? What are the disadvantages of each? And where do we think we are now with each one? And what does that mean about where we need to move forward? And that really helped people understand if we really want to advance human spaceflight, we have to bring in some more of the innovation. We have to think about new partners, new technology, different processes for certain kinds of things, while not losing sight of what has gotten us where we are, how we've achieved, and our basic, what we know about safety and what we know about human spaceflight.
So you've had great successes, great accomplishments. What would you say is your as a mistake you made that you look back on and say, boy, that was probably a big mistake, but I learned from it. And what did you learn from it?
Well, it's literally every day you go home and you're like, should I have done this better? Should I have done that better? Overall, I was pleased with the progress that we made over the last few years. One of the things that I did was we had two operations organizations, a crew operations organization and then one that was called Mission Ops, which is where the people who work in mission control and the flight directors live, and then the crew lives in this org. And about 30 years ago, probably about 35 years ago, they had split into two organizations. And you'd think they'd have very similar cultures and outlooks. but actually they had kind of morphed into very different cultures
Right.
at JSC. And to me, it was really important to get them back together. But there was a lot of history and a lot of emotion between why they split. So it was difficult to put them together. You'd think that would be very easy, but it was actually very difficult. And there were a couple of really good senior leaders who ended up leaving because I didn't choose them to lead the new organization, or their vision for it was different from the vision that I had. What I really wanted to make sure is that we didn't have like a head of operations, and then the very next level was, flight crew and mission ops.
Right.
Because then all I've done is add one layer of bureaucracy, right? I really wanted them to have a much more flat organization where when we had a training organization, it was we're training astronauts and we're training flight controllers and we're training flight directors. And right now we had two different ones. And I can remember I used to have these coffees once a month with just, random groups of employees. And not too long after I put them together, there was an employee from this now joint organization. And she's like, I really think this is a good idea. But she goes, you have no idea how emotional it is. I said, actually, I knew it was going to be incredibly emotional for the people in those organizations. But I kept asking I would literally lose sleep at night and say, is this the right thing? Do I really think for the future of Johnson Space Center that this is the right thing to do? And I kept coming back to, I do, I really do. So anyway, I think it's actually worked out well, but I'm sure you could find people who would
it's
disagree with
interesting.
that.
But it shows the human, we talk about this a lot here, the human capital, the people side is the part that keeps you up at night the most. Why is space travel important? And as the country, are we increasing our emphasis on it, or are we about the same, or are we decreasing our emphasis? And why is it important to the United States?
Yeah. So, one of the things that that NASA leadership as a whole did, and I do have to point out somebody here who used to be NASA leadership, whereas Lisa Rowe over here.
Absolutely.
She's now the chancellor of the University of North Texas, but she had a 25-year at least. Oh my gosh, 33-year career at NASA. And so she was one of the top leaders at headquarters, so this is part of her doing. But we really tried to take a step back before the change in administration, during 2016, because you always know, okay, a new administration's going to come in, and you're going to need to explain, what NASA's all about, why we, and not only what we do, which we're actually pretty good, I think, at explaining, but we probably oftentimes don't focus as much on why we do what we do. Why is it that the nation, especially in this day and age, has a program, a national space program, especially when other companies are now developing the capability to launch on their own? And I think there's a variety of reasons. Certainly one is expanding scientific knowledge. That's one of the reasons we exist. We've done a great job at it. And, I think people, they see the pictures from the Hubble Space Telescope, or they see some of the science that we're able to do on the space station now. And it's exciting to them. They don't always totally understand exactly what we're learning. But they really like the fact that we have this organization that does it. Part of it is global collaboration and leadership. And, throughout NASA's history, obviously starting from the very beginning, it was about our place in the geopolitical arena, right? And so for a long time, it was more of a competition. And over the last 20, 25 years, it's been much more of a collaboration. And it's been very, very interesting, over the last 25 years when we have worked very closely with the Russians on the space station. The U.S.-Russian relationships have, ebbed and flowed. Sometimes they've been strong, other times, not nearly as much. And yet we've managed to maintain a very close and strong relationship in space through the International Space Station, and oftentimes in Washington they have pointed to that. Hey, things aren't necessarily where we want them to be with Russia, But we do have this one area in which we collaborate very strongly, and I think that has been an advantage that NASA has been able to bring as a civilian organization. So that's another reason.
So I worked a lot in my career with the aerospace companies, and one of the things I'd always heard was a lot of the innovations that we now use commonly here, some of them were developed in space.
Yeah.
Why is it easier to do those innovations in space?
It depends on what you're looking at or talking about. So in some cases, it's the actual microgravity environment. So if you're looking at like new materials, you know, they're going to sediment out in a particular way here on Earth because of gravity, and you can get them to, join in much different ways and form colloids and kind of develop new materials.
Okay.
You can form more perfect materials like crystals of human proteins. So I know on a couple of my shuttle flights we grew protein crystals, and they grow much more aligned in space. And so if you then do X-ray crystallography and you're trying to understand the structure of the protein, you can get a much better picture of that from proteins that have been grown in space than here on Earth. So that's some of the reason.
Okay.
In some cases, you're doing Earth resources, right? And so you're looking at the Earth, and you have this opportunity to go over the entire populated section of the Earth on the shuttle.
And observe it.
So it kind of depends. In each area, there's some advantage. In biology, I was talking about this earlier in the town hall. If you're dealing with stem cells or other types of things, they operate more in a 3D function in the same way they do in your body, whereas in a laboratory, you end up more in a 2D, two-dimensional grid of cells, and then it's just not as good in analog to what's actually going on in your body. So that's another way.
So I'm going to ask you one last space question because somebody's going to ask some. I was we'll get it in now. And you can probably guess what I'm asking. Space Force.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know this is more about the Department of Defense, not because you're a separate entity. Does that affect? Is that something you just observe?
So first of all, I left NASA in May.
Yeah.
So what I know about the Space Force is what everybody reads in the paper.
Sure.
So I haven't been privy to anything else. But you're right. So NASA's civilian organization, and this is really focused on the space portion of the Department of Defense. But as far as I can tell, what's behind it, and it's a very important question, is the way our whole country operates now, businesses as well as our military depend on our assets in space.
Yeah.
And there are countries that have developed the capability to take out space assets.
I see.
And we need to make sure that we're protecting them.
Okay.
For our military, but also, national security depends on your businesses continuing to run as well. Yep. And a lot of those depend on space assets. So I think it's really about making sure that we have a focus on protecting our assets in space.
So before I turn it to the group here, so how'd you get involved with the Federal Reserve? So from all this,
I know.
So if you really wanted some real excitement, and you decided, where do I look?
Exactly.
Fed.
Well, it was either an email or a phone call completely out of the blue from, Donald Bowers at the Houston branch.
Yeah.
And of course, at the branch offices, what they try to do is get people who are running organizations in different industries that are important to that area of the district. And so when I remember having this conversation with Donald, because this really did come out of the blue. And he said, well, as it turns out, we looked and we'd never really had anybody from NASA or the aerospace sector be on the Houston branch board. And, we think it's time to get somebody like that on the board, and would you be interested? So I had to ask a lot more questions about what does it mean to be a branch board director and who else was on it. But I loved, of course, the years that I spent on that board.
And we have a number of current and former directors here. So just for those who are just to get an idea, what's the most valuable thing you learn from being, the director experience? Most directors it's a great experience. What's for you? What's the most rewarding, valuable thing you learned in this experience on the Fed board?
I'll talk a little bit about maybe the whole system and then a little bit more about Houston. But obviously, I started to pay a lot more attention to what the Fed does and what its job is.
Right.
And as you know, they bring directors to Washington, and you get a chance to meet all the board of governors. So I remember pretty early on meeting Janet Yellen,
Yeah.
and somebody asked her, "What would you like people to know about the Fed that you think they don't really know?" And she said, "I would like you to go back and tell people that you talk with that the Fed governors are a group of very thoughtful people who work really hard to make sure that they're meeting the dual mandate of the Fed."
Yeah.
And that, we do get appointed, of course, by one administration, but purposely the appointments last, so that they're not coinciding with administrations. And that we focus on the mandate, and we're a group of very thoughtful people.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Because, you can
true.
read quite often, whether it's opinion papers or whatever
course.
about, there's a particular administration bent, and so the Fed's just doing that. And so I remember hearing that from her, and that was interesting. And then for me, I was just becoming director of Johnson Space Center. It was a chance to meet the leaders of companies and other industries in Houston and to talk about what NASA was doing to them and to learn a lot more about Houston from those folks. So it was just so interesting.
All right, that's
Yeah.
great. Thank you. All right, we're going to turn to the group here. Questions? Just go, if you just stand up at the mic though, and try to keep your keep your questions brief, and we'll take as many as we can. So fire away. Go ahead.
I'll speak as loud as I need to. Thank you for all the things you've done at the Johnson Space Center and out in space. I work for a company that makes almost all the flight controls on the space shuttle.
Oh, good.
And I'm also on the board of Hartman Woodward Institute that placed one of the protein crystallization experiments on the shuttle. So a couple of points of connection to what you were saying there. My question, is it okay to ask something related to NASA and not the
Yeah,
Fed?
please. And I just want to get as many questions as we
Sure.
can. So
My-
fire away.
My question strictly is this. We've studied the Challenger and Discovery accidents quite a bit. Has NASA grown up to be immune to the kind of political pressures that were exerted that were a big factor behind those accidents in the decision-making process?
Interesting question.
Well, what I would say is, what we've learned from both the Challenger and the Columbia is that we're human and that you can never feel like you're not in the situation where something like that could happen again. So you have to constantly be questioning yourself about, are we asking the right questions? Do we know the vehicle and the risks? Do we feel like we've assessed them appropriately? You're always launching or doing something in space with some risk. It's never without risk. But have we done a good job of assessing those risks, of mitigating the ones that we are able to mitigate, and do we feel that the risk that we're taking is commensurate with the kind of mission that we're doing? What a lot of it came down to for both of those was communication among folks. In both cases, there was certainly a pressure to launch, right? But we have to be the ones that realize, okay, this is what's going on. These are the questions that we need to ask. These are the people that we have to call into. So we're absolutely not immune. We'll never be immune. And if we ever think we are, we'll be very dangerous, because you have to always have that top of mind to be asking those questions and to realize that something like that can happen. It's one of the reasons we actually really focus on inclusion at NASA. There's a lot of good reasons to focus on inclusion. But one of them is you need every single person who is working at your center to realize I have a responsibility to use my brain, to speak up if I think I have something to contribute to this conversation. But if you're somebody that feels like you're not valued or you're not respected, or if I speak up, people aren't going to listen, then you don't enter
Shut
into
down.
that conversation, and we're less safe in that situation. So in addition to many other reasons, we really need people to feel comfortable speaking up, and that's one way that you can do
great.
it, where if you have a culture of people feeling valued.
Yes, sir.
Assuming that the International Space Station is eventually retired and defunded, in terms of the scientific aspects, but also the international coordination aspects, how would you recommend that we use those funds?
Yeah, so we're already we're very much involved in the International Space Station, and it's really important to NASA to use it to learn more about long duration flights. But we're already starting to make investments in going beyond low Earth orbit. So you may have read in the news about the Gateway concept that we are working on right now, which is to put some infrastructure in orbit around the moon. And I really see that, and everybody at NASA really sees it as a collaboration in much the similar way that we have on the International Space Station now, where you have international partners, and then you also have services that are provided by commercial companies. And different companies may have very different goals for going either around the moon or on the moon, but if we can help provide an infrastructure that allows different companies to support different kinds of goals, then we can also get the benefit from that as well. Learn more about what it takes to live further from Earth, and that will help us eventually on our way to Mars as well. So we're already working on that. You know, we have the Orion spacecraft that we're developing at Johnson. We have a heavy lift rocket that's being developed at another NASA center. We're working on the first part of this Gateway, which is a power propulsion element using solar electric propulsion. And we're looking at concepts for kind of a habitation module where astronauts might stay a month or 2 months or 3 months at a time. It wouldn't be necessarily permanently manned like the ISS. So that's kind of the next step, and we've got some momentum. The hardest thing this country has, though, to do is maintaining momentum in a particular direction for human spaceflight.
Yeah.
So I'm like, we need to maintain momentum. That would be really good.
Why is it so hard?
Because different administrations come in with different goals.
I see.
Yeah.
Got it. Yes, sir.
Again, congratulations on your great career.
Thank you.
If you're able, can you tell us how dangerous is the possibility of weaponization of space?
Well, that would probably be more on the Department of Defense space side than it would be on NASA's. And so we really focus at NASA on, the science exploration and economic benefits that we can provide back to Earth based on, research and activities that we do there. So we really sort of depend on the Department of Defense to, they already have a space command. They're looking at the Space Force to understand space from the aspect of more of a military field.
I'm going to ask you one question. We talk a lot at the Fed here about the importance of education and the fact that this country has slipped
Right.
in math, science, reading, science, technology, the other engineering. And we're very concerned about it, and we're concerned the effect it's having on GDP and productivity.
Yeah.
What would be your advice as to what this country needs to do? Why STEM is important, and what should we be doing?
Well, so much of what has led to, economic strength in this country has been based on science and engineering. Starting with basic research into science, which leads to engineering advances, which leads to, new industries, new markets, productivity. So I think that's why it's important to the country. And of course, NASA has always had its role to play in that.
Right.
One of my other jobs is as vice chair of the National Science Board. And of course, that's the board that governs the National Science Foundation. Mm-hmm. And so their investments in basic research, I think, have been and continue to be incredibly important to our country. Mm-hmm. So that's one aspect of it. When you look even though beyond careers in science and engineering, you can see that technology has crept into, so many other industries. The National Science Board put out a policy piece about the importance of a skilled technical workforce to our country.
Yeah.
And part of it talked about, there's a third more jobs requiring knowledge of technology now than there were, 5 or 10 years ago. And so we really need at all levels to make sure that we have people that are studying.
And does your work
Yeah.
there suggest we are getting better, worse? What are you seeing in terms of how this country's doing?
So one of the things that we've pointed out is, just actually, this is very similar to NASA as well. The budget of NSF has stayed relatively constant.
Okay.
So when you look at what some other countries are doing, they are investing in a much bigger way.
Got it.
So the slope of China's curve in terms of how much they're putting into science R&D is very large, and ours is basically flat. And in fact, based on data from a couple years ago, this is probably the year where China spends more than the U.S. on science R&D for the first time, more dollars. So that's not necessarily more per capita, because
Right.
they have a very large population.
Right.
But this is the year they pass us, we believe, in the amount of money that they're spending, and they're on a pretty upward trajectory. So as you think about, just in 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, what's going to be generating the economic growth in this country? I think a lot of it does start with science research and then engineering research. And if we're staying flat at best,
Yeah.
and other countries are putting a lot more into it because they've seen what that does, then that says something about our potential position in the world.
Are you measuring government funding, or this is government and academia?
It's both. There's
So with
there's
all sectors,
data collected
and
that
even
actually,
with that, we're flat.
yeah.
Wow.
Well, so the flat part, I will say, is specifically NSF's
Okay.
funding.
Got it.
But in terms of the total amount of R&D, we looked at that information, and we're, our slope is much different than some countries that
Okay.
are really putting a lot more
That's
into
interesting.
it.
Yes,
Yeah.
please. Yep.
Well, I'm so glad to see you again as we visited a little while ago. I'm Ana Hernandez with Plains Capital Bank and also part of the Hispanic Women's Network of Texas. And certainly Dr. Ochoa was one of our trailblazers several years ago, and we were very proud of that. But I do have a question. You certainly broken a lot of barriers. And one specifically, as a woman going into a field of male-dominated position and as a Latina, can you share some insights of how you kind of broke some of those barriers?
Well, part of it, so I talked a little bit about just how getting into science, and certainly one of the things that we still see is oftentimes women and oftentimes minorities are still not encouraged to go into fields like that. So I will say I've gotten a lot of support during the years with people that I worked with, bosses that I've had, and of course every supervisor I've ever had has been a man, and I don't think any of them have been Latino. So I do want to make sure that I've gotten a lot of great support along the way. But there are also people can say things that where people make decisions, both for good and for ill, in terms of how they interact with people. What I just tried to do was say, what is it I really want to do? And if I work hard, I'm just going to try. I'm just going to try. I don't know what's really going to happen, but I'm going to try because it's something I really want to do, and it's something I'm very interested in. So, I always did my homework. I came prepared, and that was what I knew what to do. There are things when I look back now that I wish also I had done that I didn't know enough to do. For example, at most universities, there are student groups, Society of Women Engineers, Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, and people have the opportunity to kind of have a support group. Because if you're in science or engineering, you're going to struggle in a class. You're probably going to struggle in a lot of classes. You're always doing problem sets. There's always problems with doing problem sets. You always struggle. But you can often feel like you're the only one struggling if you're not really talking to anybody else or you don't really have that support structure. And so having these societies where there's student groups, I think, provides a lot of that I actually didn't even know enough to ask about or know about when I was in college. So a lot of times it was just like, well, I'm struggling, but you know, I have to just work harder and work through it. And at San Diego State, I got to the point where I was really getting the highest grade in every class I was in, and I was realizing, like, okay, I can't psych myself out. I can actually do this, and I don't need to talk myself out of it. But not everybody, has. You've got to have some inner determination, and it's really nice if you can have a support group like that where you can just talk to other students that are like, oh yeah, this is hard, or that particular class, like everybody struggles in it, right?
I was wondering if you might be able to paint a picture of the future for us, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years out. What would you love to see the space program do?
Well, part of it I was talking about with the Gateway. So, I don't know if people really realize, but there is more development of human spacecraft going on in the U.S. right now than has ever occurred in our country. We have 3 new human spacecraft being developed, the Orion to go beyond low Earth orbit, and then Boeing's Starliner and SpaceX's Crew Dragon, which they are developing to take our astronauts to and from low Earth orbit, the International Space Station. And then there's also rockets that are being developed as well. And so it's actually a really interesting, incredible time in our country for human spaceflight. And that's one of the reasons I'm very excited about the future. And I want to see these companies be able to develop these services and really get to the point where they can do all of the low Earth orbit kinds of things that we do now.
And the customer for these companies, all governmental customers, or not necessarily?
Right now, obviously, NASA is still the anchor customer.
Okay.
But by having these service contracts, rather than us owning the vehicles, we always had other companies build them for us, right?
Yeah.
NASA was never in the manufacturing, so we always worked with aerospace companies. But we owned the vehicle, we
Yeah.
operated the vehicle. And now we have a different model where Boeing and SpaceX will own these vehicles. They will operate the vehicles,
Okay.
and they can go out and find other customers. And so they are already talking with other customers. Now, for the next few years, I really don't see any big customer that, really comes in and is anywhere near, what NASA needs or what NASA's been able to provide. But that's the hope, that they will move on, and both for it could be robotics. It's not necessarily all human space flight. You might have a small space manufacturing facility based on something that we've learned on the International Space Station that is, say, mostly untended, but could be visited by crew members who belong to a particular company to change out things or repair or whatever. But most of the time it's working away. So you can see these things coming in the future that we hope we are seeding right now at NASA. But I'm hoping that NASA itself is going to go beyond low Earth orbit and initially around the moon and then on to Mars.
I'm going to ask you just a couple of closing questions. You're a role model, as we've just heard, to many people. Are there 1 or 2 or 3 role models that you've looked up to that inspired you?
Well, probably the person that had the biggest effect on my life was my mother, and she was just very interested in education. And it wasn't just that she knew education was important to her kids' future. She absolutely just loved learning. So when my 4 brothers and sisters and I were growing up, she would take 1 college class a semester just because she wanted to learn something new. And, 20 years later, she got her college degree, a year after I got mine.
Wow. That's
But
great.
we all saw that. And so that certainly had a big impact on us. I mentioned the first 6 women astronauts and Sally Ride in particular. Even when they were selected, I had never thought about being an astronaut and still didn't for another 2 or 3 few years. But it was a big deal. And the fact that I had a chance to talk to him when I was actually thinking about becoming an astronaut and understand from them, that was really important to me as well.
Okay. What's next for you? I know we've talked a lot
Yeah.
about this, obviously moving to Idaho.
So,
and so
right. So a lot of what I'm doing is on boards, and the National Science Board is an important one to me because it keeps me connected with science and engineering, which I think is so important. On a couple corporate boards, and of course I'm doing some speaking. I, spoke to some students in New Jersey last week. They're a school district that's going to name a school after me. They're breaking ground shortly.
Wow.
And I
Congratulations.
spoke at some universities for some students there. So I still have the chance to go around and talk.
And when you give advice to students today, young people, what's the one or two key pieces of advice you give them?
Well, first of all, I want to make sure they understand what kinds of interesting and challenging and rewarding careers I think there are when you do study science and engineering. And there's a whole variety of them. It's not just the astronaut office. So that's one thing. It's kind of like, yeah, it is really worth it if you go off and study this. Sometimes I talk about, joining some of these student groups, making sure they get help when they need it. Because a lot of people who drop out of science and engineering, they have one tough class, and then they think like, gosh, my roommate's, studying communications. That seems like a lot easier. Why am I beating my head against the wall? But reminding them, hey, professors have office hours, there's tutors, you power through it, and there's a lot of really exciting careers out there for you.
All right, great. Ellen, thank you for doing everything you've done. Thank you for your leadership. And thank you, everyone.